Welcome to London, everyone. Today we're going to be introducing the Housing and Urbanism program of the Graduate School at the Architectural Association. And I'm delighted to be able to present with some of our current and former students here at the Housing and Urbanism program. So to my left, I have Simran, and in the middle, Echo. And to my far left is Ellis, who's a former student in our program. I'm Lawrence Barth, and I'm one of the co-directors of Housing and Urbanism, and we're delighted to present our program to you today. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about what's distinctive about housing and urbanism. And the key thing that defines the Housing and Urbanism program is the way in which we integrate critical thinking with a design-driven approach to architecture and urbanism. So we look at the fundamental challenge of design as being in the effective transformation of cities. So we want to make sure that our students are able and capable of understanding the urban process, and that when they think through design, they're thinking about urban strategies, they're thinking about actors, they're able to work through arguments and to understand processes in a way that gives them an ability to feel in a position of leadership or in a position of being effective at evaluating strategies that cities define. Now, one of the first things that I want to do then is to clarify how our program is structured so that we can achieve that, and to give you some sense of the kind of course it is and the degrees that we offer. So if we can look at the first slide, you'll see that we divide our program into courses, which we see on the left, study trips and design workshop, which you see over on the right, and these come together in terms of in the sense of a kind of consistent and integrated thought process and research process at the heart of the program. And then at the bottom, you can see that it leads to a design thesis. Now, that design thesis might be an MA or it might be an MArch. The MArch is a 16-month program and the MA is a 12-month program. But each of them are based on design reasoning in such a way that we use design to think about what will make cities effective and successful at achieving their ambitions. So let me first take you through some of what's on the left. You can, in the previous image, we could see that there were a series of courses. And these courses are meant to help students understand complex environments, to be able to understand the way cities are changing, how they're going from situations of decay to new patterns of central city development where there's a lot of vitality and vibrancy. We want to make sure that students understand how those processes are taking place and the kind of design decisions that are enabling cities to be effective at creating new living and working environments. And so we're looking at plans, we're looking at projects that are exemplary. We do that through our lecture series. We make sure that students have an awareness of the design and the design process and the planning process, the building process, and the kinds of outcomes. We want students to have a good feel for the way in which the current projects are leading to successful projects. The successful cities. And this, we're a quite international and comparative program. We study abroad a lot, we engage with foreign governments, but also our examples in lectures are drawn from widely around the world. We're interested in everything from very highly commercial projects to the informal. We pay a lot of attention to the life of the street, the everyday process, as well as the key actors, but also the kinds of transitions that we have seen over the last century in the way in which we envision the architecture of living and working. Now, I'd like to begin now to talk with our current students because I think for many of you who are looking at this live streaming, you're wanting to know in a sense, what it's like to be a student in the Housing and Urbanism program. And you're going to want to have a chance, perhaps even to ask us some questions about what the students feel about working in this program. So I'm going to start by introducing in the middle Echo, who's going to be talking with me on a couple topics that we think are really fundamental to our program, and that has to do with the way in which we work. We begin the first term with a series of exercises that are meant in a way to develop a common language of drawing, and they also are based on showing students what we think of as exemplary projects. And I'm wondering if you can remember back, Echo. It's now been a year ago since you witnessed those or were part of those exercises. But how did they help you see architecture in a new way?
Well, I guess it helps us see the projects, particularly in sets. So it's easy for us to make comparison across different projects, across different scale. We might look at it from the scale of like interior, like how we are living or working in a space, or even from the urban scale of how a project is really leading the trend or influencing how the city is developing. And also it helps us see the connection between architecture and the urban trends that are already happening.
Yeah. And I think in a way that those first exercises, they start to give everyone a way of beginning to communicate through the idea of an architectural project. And you know, when we finally bring that towards the final exercise, Simran, I think in a way we can start to see something else happening within the program. We move from simply being analytical to becoming, in a way, slightly more focused on integration and the possibility of a project that really shows complexity, don't we?
Yeah, we start whatever tools and methodologies that we analyze from our case studies or precedents. It starts finally coming together and we start implementing it in our design projects. And what it does is, for example, a project that we did in Camden, it starts on emphasizing on the different interconnections, multiplicity, transparency, and all the different aspects that we learned from our previous case studies.
Yeah. Now, I think, this is one of the things that we're always trying to do is we're trying to build students' understanding of the way in which architecture provides a set of tools and vehicles for building an awareness of the complexity of the urban process. And so we're using drawing to help think through those processes. But Echo, I think one of the things that becomes interesting then is the way in which our study trips contribute to that. And this year we're going to be going with our students to Basel and Zurich, and you can see an image of that on the screen now. In previous years, last year we went to Berlin. We've gone to Berlin a couple of times. But perhaps you could tell us how the study trip contributes to the understanding that we bring to the design workshop then.
Yeah, I think for us, for our program, one emphasis is on walking, observing, and really understanding the architecture within the city. So it's very important that we are into the environment, and then we get the feeling of the relationship between the urban process and the architecture that delivers it.
Yeah,
and
we can kind of see some of the on these slides. You can kind of see some of the feel we get when we're walking through the city. This is I think some of what you're talking about is that way that we explore by actually treating the city as a kind of live exhibition space. Yeah, carry on. I know you had more things you wanted to say about it.
Yeah, because I feel that this is something which is kind of difficult to convey, either through journals or exhibitions or other traditional ways that we learn architecture. And also, then we are able to see architecture in its living state. So it brings a brand new feeling of how we study the entire city.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that we feel very strongly as a program. In a lot of these images, we can kind of see that the city has a grittiness and a grain. There's an attention to the way in which people actually live, the way in which new kinds of businesses are forming. And I think one of the things that then is really important about that for us is the way in which we sort of look at the city that is something that is meant to be experienced at multiple levels. That is, it's an everyday experience, but from the point of view of government decision makers, from the point of view of the key actors in the development process, they're looking at this in ways that are very summative. And we have to be able to understand what those major processes are that enable governments and investors to come together. And we recognize that the architect has a role in both directions, in the sense that they have to be able to understand the final user and also the major actors in a puzzle. And so whether that's housing that is being driven, in a sense, by the users themselves, or whether that's major projects being planned by cities, we're trying to give students an opportunity to understand what's driving those projects. So here in this image, we see a housing project that has been developed in Berlin that is very indicative of a pattern of user-driven housing, user-driven residential environments that has become very typical of the process of development in Berlin. And we see that there's a very inventive approach to interiors and to the way in which these projects fit in the city. But it's also part of a quite significant governmental effort to rethink the relationship between parks, infrastructure, transport, recreation, and housing. So we want to be able to understand the process at all of these scales. This kind of reminds me of something else that I wanted to talk to you about, Simran. And in a way, what we've talked about now is a program that puts urban observation, the design workshop, drawing in order to think. We put that very much at the heart of the program. But then, if that's the case, what's the role of the lectures and seminar series that we have?
Just besides lectures and seminars, we also have a broad range of readings that are available for each and every topic or course that we have. And we're lucky that way that Housing and Urbanism emphasizes equally on both reading and our lectures and design workshop. But the broad range kind of helps us as an advantage for each student to take up independently whatever direction they want for an argument for themselves. Moreover, lectures or seminars start giving you different layers for a project that you study, because, for example, through critical urbanism, we start realizing the politics and the philosophies behind different projects, and then transnational cities, and we start realizing that there are different economics and social aspects to different cities.
Yeah. So one of the things that we emphasize is that there's not a single way to do urbanism. There's not a single style. There's not a single method. And in fact, the students who come here are very, very different. They bring a lot of different experiences, different interests. And what we try to do is to cultivate a common dialogue among students who have a great diversity of points of view and passions. And I think our reading list and our courses are devised in such a way that we help students understand the fundamentals and a common language, while nevertheless being able to pursue quite different patterns of research. In some ways, I feel like this is one of the things that makes London kind of distinctive as a city to study in, because it allows us to think about the way in which there are a variety of forces in the city. London is so vast, it enables us to really treat this as though this city as though it is an indication of international urban processes. I know, Ellis, you found that in thinking about your thesis. I mean, before we actually get on to talking about your thesis, which we'll do shortly, I think one of the things that was interesting is that when you first were thinking of your thesis project, you were planning on doing something on Mexico City.
In the Mexican airport, yeah.
And yet you found that London provided you with conditions that would enable you to study those processes here.
Well, yes, to be honest, London is one of the places that you should learn. And I think governments, they ask for London consultants to go to these kind of countries and advise how the city will evolve, because I think the major or the more recent trends are delivered in London, and you can see how this city is changing all the time. It's from south to north, and after when you start working, then you start facing all these problems that we research through the thesis. So I think it was the best decision just to base my thesis in London and then learn from this. So then in the future, if I go back to Latin America, who knows?
Yeah.
I can apply that knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, so we do believe that London is a great city to learn from and a great city to research, and it cultivates an understanding of multiplicity, diversity, intensification, integration, the processes that matter most to cities worldwide. But Simran, I'm kind of curious, if London may be a great laboratory, but is it also a reasonable place to live?
Yes, of course. I think one of the reasons for choosing AA was also London, because you have whatever you learn in the studio, you can actually see it happening in the city. So if you walk down from even if you walk down from your school and back home, you see different firms that are up on the street, the different exhibitions that actually talk about the same things that we are talking about, making it pretty relevant. But more than that, it starts being a very personal place to live, to start having your own little family away from home. And it's not just our friends, but the faculty and the staff's a very closely integrated society, and it's much easier having a chat with the tutors and from students across the programs as well.
Yeah, London is a city that seems very much to welcome people from around the world. All of us have settled here from the Americas, from Eastern Asia, Southern Asia, from Europe, from the Middle East. It's a city that actually makes it very easy to live here as a newcomer. And I think this is one of the things that makes London so valuable as well, is that we can come together as a team and emphasize a collaborative spirit at the same time that the city supports that. I want to ask then, from your point of view, Echo, what sort of student would be most attracted to housing and urbanism?
Well, I think that's really interesting to talk about, because this is something I realized after I come here and I study with all those students. And I feel that somehow we're all very passionate about exploring what is really happening around us and what is really happening in the cities around the world. And so this is somehow the curiosity drag us here, and we became like a program and study together. And then we are the people who are really willing to network and to absorb others' ideas, so that we can talk with people from like so diverse cultural backgrounds. It's something I could never imagine before. And I feel that's really a fascinating part of our program.
If we think about the other graduate programs, in a way, each of the graduate programs at the AA is quite distinctive in terms of their approach and their method. Some emphasize computation, some emphasize historical and critical thinking. In many respects, we kind of work in between some of those, in that we try to cultivate a critical attitude, but in a very projective way rather than an historical way. But what's the experience like in terms of getting an opportunity to learn from your peers in the other programs? Do you have any chance to do that?
Well, I think this brings like a new aspect for me, for like students like me to learn from learn other ways of thinking. For example, if you focus on the way of computer-based, software-based design, and then you have another way of doing design, of approaching the ambitions and the design approaches that you want to observe and you want to achieve. But then for us, it's like through reading and drawing, critical thinking, discussing with others, it's also another way of looking at the design issues.
I think that's right. And I think that's one of the things that makes the AA such a brilliant place to teach for me. And it's the richness of the entire graduate school in a way. But where I think we experience the richness perhaps most strongly is in the students' selection of their dissertation topic. This is where, in a way, everything that they've been absorbing through the year becomes their own thesis. It becomes their own domain of expertise. In this image that we can see here, we've got a picture of São Paulo, and in this picture, we can see something that is very international: the investment in major infrastructure, and then the follow-on decisions of a series of actors. How do they invest in ways that bring out the value of government's decisions to invest in transport infrastructure? And this question of mobility and then intensification, investment and integration, these kinds of things are very interesting to us, but they create problems, and it's these problems that students then get to investigate. And so I was going to ask Simran, as you've now started to look at the idea that there's potentially a new approach to housing that can deal with the fact that we're now almost in a period of what we might think of as the post-creative city. The creative city has become such a cliche. We're saturated with the idea of creativity, and now you're starting to think about the idea that there is perhaps an approach to housing that can accommodate some of the current challenges of dealing with the creative economy and trying to maintain its progress. But how did you come to that thesis idea? Where did it begin for you?
I think the design workshop, starting from term one, pretty much laid it all down for us. But that was only because the brief was so flexible. Starting from term one, continuing to term two, we were given the freedom of having our own direction, and so in term two we focused heavily on food industries, and that was only our group. But then it was fascinating to see how different groups interpreted this idea of creative city, and that's where once we start talking with our peers and realizing what they're doing, I started getting this overview that there's just more to one concentrated effect of a certain industry in the city, and that's how I started questioning and realizing the challenges that all cities throughout the world have regarding the saturation of this creativity.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things we start to discover that in any particular urban state or urban phenomenon, one of the things that we notice is that there are many different ways of approaching the challenge of transformation and progress. And this enables students to bring a point of view to the way in which they would like to see the city change through a project. So if I come back to the screen, one of our students a few years ago looked at that exact condition in São Paulo and noticed that all of the investment for transport infrastructure was in a way tending to exacerbate some of the fundamental weaknesses of a monocentric city. And what she was wanting to do is to think about if there wasn't a way of bringing greater value out of investment in transport infrastructure by, at the same time, rethinking the planning guidelines and the spatial development of the peripheral communities, a new kind of polycentrism, if you will. And so in an area where she was beginning to notice that there were concentrations of educational services, this concentration could lead to a rethinking of the spatial qualities. And the pattern of development there was to put new high-rises into an urban structure that was very, very closed in terms of the way in which the blocks worked. Very, very different than what we learned in Berlin about quite open blocks, very absorptive blocks. Here they were very impermeable, and the introduction of towers exacerbates that. So each time a tower would come in, it would create more pressure on the streets, which couldn't be accommodated. And so she began to think in terms of looking at this as a broader challenge of integration and encouraging permeability. But this, one of the things that this would do would be to imply a different set of developments. Then what are the actors? Who are the actors? What's the approach to housing, to recreation, and especially to education? So she began to look at the idea that there might be a way of interpreting some of their educational institutions in such a way that it could deliver a more permeable block environment. And this could be supported with housing that is typologically slightly different. And could make good use of these new patterns of orientation, creating new kinds of public environments and collective realm. Now, the outcome of this then was that she began to envision an environment that would bring greater value out of the development of the infrastructure. And so then coming back to the station area begins to characterize a way in which government might wish to rethink their approaches to the planning guidelines for these areas. So it's using architecture to help us think about the change in governance. Now, this is actually something that's being taken up in Sao Paulo, and in fact, Mariana is now leading and helping developers together with the city rethink some of these areas on the basis of her thesis. So it's a way in which the openness here leads to a genuine research topic that enables her to think differently about the future of the city. Similarly, another student recently completed a project on that was based here in London on a new approach to a very highly serviced environment for extending lifelong living as a concept for rethinking the way in which cities can include services together with residents, so you can have all ages living in an area. And one of the things that was very interesting about her work is that it's now being taken up in Beijing as guidance for peripheral developments on the outskirts of the city, how they can have greater servicing, more compact and sustainable understanding of spatial development. But now I want to turn to Ellis, who wrote an absolutely marvelous thesis on the urban industrial here in London. Right. And Ellis, could you tell us a little bit about the way in which your project was related to the problems you saw in London around the question of industrial life?
Well, just to start, and summarize what the workshop was, we had a workshop in Malmö, a former industrial state. So the interest for industrial estates started from that point. And then once I moved to choose my topic, I had a long discussion with Larry, and I chose London. And everything came from an article of how industrial landlords are putting pressure to go back to the city center. And following these trends, you need, cities like London need a proximity between different users, between consumers, between housing environments, and between productive environments. So all these diagrams that you are showing are trying to analyze this kind of connectivity to the city center. So for me, the challenging part was the regeneration of the canal side. And after I finished this thesis, I've been involved in different projects that actually addresses how to change the canal side.
Yeah.
So
in fact, you can kind of see the early starts of this on this image. Here's where you began to reinterpret an industrial environment as something that begins to have something much more the feeling of a plaid, a tartan, where things become integrated and interconnected. Right. And you took this kind of as a design direction where you were recognizing the fundamental significance of the canal as a multi-purpose environment.
Yeah. And as well how the industry is evolving, because canals were the main route of connection between different industries around London, and now we have different kind of technologies. The drones, Amazon is a major influence how the whole is changing. But at the same time, we explore housing, I explored in the thesis the housing, and I was challenging the typical typologies that were delivered in that area, which were like small blocks and with a very low density. So I went back to kind of 1960s with a long slab, trying to challenge, and evolve that topology and merge it into this industrial new environment.
Yeah, you were looking for something that had the force to match the look, feel, pattern, and grain of an industrial environment. And at the same time, you were beginning to recognize that today an industrial environment is a very creative environment at the same moment that it's technical. And I think this is one of the things that led to such richness in your project.
Yeah.
But how has that played out then in years now that you've left housing and urbanism and you've gone on to have a career?
Yeah, well, I finished this thesis almost 2 years ago. It seems like yesterday, to be honest. But it gave me a lot of different tools to approach to different projects. So all the things that you have discussing in these minutes about how to explore drawing, how, even parametric design is a very particular thing. I think what HNU gives you is that you can be involved in any single project. And basically because in London, there is a very strict process of delivering projects where the planning authorities, they have a lot of power. So you have to understand how the city is changing and convince these planners that your proposal is innovative and addresses all the problems of the city. So I think, I've been involved in business parks, I've been involved in master planning, and now I'm working in Science Park. And you can see how HNU gave me this flexibility to approach and understand how each of the elements of each project works. Because it's not only about the architecture, the thing that changed for me, I came here as a designer, but then I became an urbanist. And I understood how government, how developers, and how designers can work as a team.
Yeah. Well, we'd like to conclude on that message. We invite people who have an interest in collaboration, in networking, in comparative thinking, who see themselves as, in a sense, world citizens, but who want to come together and work here on projects that allow us to really focus on what architecture contributes to that collaborative process. All of us, in a way, bring a certain passion for the way in which cities really work, but we want to look at that from the point of view that allows us to be critical, to allow us to think about the politics of change just as much as we think about the sound design of the future city. So we hope you'll come and join us. We hope we've encouraged you to apply and open up a conversation with us. We look forward to seeing you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.